Hi to everyone. Today we are starting another program from the Law Student Association of Sri Lanka. And today we have an interesting individual joining with us, Jojo Mehta. So to give a small introduction about her, we have a lot, but we'll take it very brief for the concern of time. Jojo Mehta is a co-founder and a CEO of the Stop Ecocide International, a global movement launched in 2017 to criminalize uh, the environmental harm to ecocide under international law. As a key spokesman, she has driven the movement's growth, fostering legal, diplomatic, and public support across 45 countries. And Jojo chairs the Stop Ecocide Foundation and convened the independent expert panel of the legal definition of ecocide, which is released a landmark definition in 2021, influencing the global policy legislation too. She's an Oxford and a London University graduate with a background in communication and activism. And Jojo is a compelling advocate for environmental justice. She has spoken to UN conferences, diplomatic events, and summits. And her work has been featured in Times, the New York Times, the Guardian, and BBC, and the list goes on. Thank you, Jojo, for accepting our request to join with us here.
Oh, it's lovely to be with you.
Okay, Jojo, so to give a beginning, to give a start to this program, I would really love to hear from you. What is this ecocide? The term ecocide, could you please explain for us today?
Absolutely. So ecocide it's generally understood to refer to the worst harms against nature. So when you think of, suicide is killing yourself, homicide is killing a person, genocide is killing a whole people. Ecocide is killing nature. In fact, in its etymology, it comes from the Greek oikos, which means home, and the Latin cadere, which means to kill. So it's also a way to say killing one's home. And I suppose what it does is it encapsulates what we can all witness happening around the world in terms of ecological destruction. But there hasn't really been a name for it. And of course, what our organization works to do is to have that legally recognized as a serious crime, so that the most severe harms to the natural living world are designated as serious crimes.
Okay, so now we have a basic idea. This is about a huge offense towards the environment because of our living matters, our living depends on the environment. And Jojo, we would really love to hear this organization, the Stop Ecocide International. So what was the reason and how was the beginning of this amazing organization started?
Thank you. Well, I came to this through on-the-ground environmental activism. I was very involved in the anti-fracking community in the UK. Some of you may be familiar with the term fracking, which is a very polluting way of getting oil and gas out from deep underground. And I remember when I first discovered about it, being quite shocked because I could not find any angle from which it seemed to work, not even economic, not in terms of its actual production of energy, but certainly not in terms of its environmental impact. And that brought me into the arena of environmental campaigning. And it was through that work that I met Polly Higgins, who was the pioneering barrister and my dear friend, with whom I co-founded what is now Stop Ecocide International. She had already been working on this idea of criminalizing ecocide for a while because she had discovered that when the governing document of the International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute, in the discussions that led up to the negotiations of that treaty, there had been consideration of potentially creating a crime that related to severe harm to nature, but it never made it into the treaty negotiations. It was part of negotiations that were discussions amongst the International Law Commission, but it didn't reach the Rome Statute. And at the time, there was no vote that had that clause drop out. It was more that there were certain countries that objected. At the time, it was the US, the UK, the Netherlands and France, all oil states, and actually at one point Brazil as well. And also at the time, all of those countries were either thinking of or engaging in nuclear testing. So you can imagine that this whole concept for them was not what they wanted to see in that treaty. Now, So the way that my colleague, sadly, she's departed now. She died in 2019 of cancer. But for the last 10 years of her life, she focused on how she saw it restoring the missing crime to the level of the international crimes. So when the International Criminal Court opened its doors, it only had war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity on its list of crimes that it could deal with at a global level. Later, the crime of aggression was also added. But we believe, Polly believed, and we believe, and our campaign is really built on this idea that severe harm to nature should be acknowledged as something very serious, and it should be added to penal codes around the world. And one of the most straightforward and simplest ways of doing that is to have it recognized as an international crime. And therefore, countries that ratify that crime will be including it in their own national penal codes as well. Now, what's been interesting is that you mentioned the important definition that emerged in 2021, and that was from an independent expert panel convened by our foundation. Now, that definition has had such a strong effect on the space, legally, academically, and politically, that in fact, what we have seen is that national and regional legal developments have come along at the same time as the international conversation. So now this is really quite a live conversation in many national jurisdictions, as well as regionally, for example, in the European Union.
Exactly. So I feel like this is not only an achievement of an organization, it is an achievement of the whole humankind, mankind, for the whole world. So I really appreciate that hard work in this. So Jojo, this is something not like doing in your own state, your own country. It is not convening a president or a prime minister. This is like going all over the world. So there may be some hardships when it comes to accepting the international laws, treaties into different countries. They have their rigid or the very straightforward movements, and some are very not into that. So I would really love to hear as an activist, and there's a huge like legal background within it, how hard it was to implement or convene these people to agree with the organization and this criminalizing the ecocide and adding that into the penal codes of the significant countries.
So I think there are a number of different aspects to this. I think, I mean, just to give a brief picture of how fast this conversation has moved. So when my dear friend Polly died in 2019, at that point, there were no governments publicly discussing ecocide law. So you could think of it, although there were the beginnings of a diplomatic conversation with the Pacific island state of Vanuatu, which has since become a big leader in this area. At that time, it was almost unheard of. Now we have a situation where there is an EU directive, environmental crime directive, that includes what they're calling a qualified offence that they describe as comparable to ecocide. And there is also a multi-state proposal now at the International Criminal Court coming from Vanuatu, Fiji, and Samoa, which are Pacific Island nations, and also supported by the Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa. And there is now a proposal on the table to amend the Rome Statute to include a crime of ecocide. So this gives you a sense of how fast this has moved. And for international law, that is, well, it's almost rocket speed in the sense that, we know it took 23 years to get to the Paris Agreement. Conventions and treaties often take many years, sometimes decades, to come into being. So this is really quite a fast movement of international law. Now, you spoke to the fact that actually this is a global development. It's not just a national development. And I think we need to look at various reasons why this has moved forward so quickly. Some of them are down to us, but some of them are not. And I think that one of the aspects is that the world in general is becoming far more aware of the dangers of environmental destruction, of the climate change that is happening really as a result. I mean, ecocide or environmental destruction over many decades is actually at the, it's a root cause of what's happening with the climate. So these things are intimately intertwined. And of course, the awareness of this globally is growing fast and has grown very fast over the last few years, not least because we can all see some of the effects that are happening. And, we can see that there are elements that are involved in terms of what happens to our ecosystems, whether it's forests, whether it's oceans, these climate regulating ecosystems as well. So I think one aspect is public awareness. Another aspect is mobilization. So we have also seen a kind of a movement globally around climate and around environment, and things like Extinction Rebellion, things like Fridays for Future, these various different movements that have been raising the alarm, that have been effectively calling attention to this conversation. Now, of course, many people may not agree with their methods, and this I very much understand. However, when we look back at all the important shifts in human rights and in democracy and so on in history, we look at the abolition of slavery, we look at the civil rights movement, we look at votes for women, all of these things, all of these key moments they begin with something disruptive in the civil society arena. And that is the opening of the conversation. And what comes next is the work towards legal change. And that is where Stop Ecocide International is focused primarily. In other words, how do we respond to this current situation? What are the legal changes that are needed? And I think at this point, we come to see where it is that what we do as an organization has come into play, because we very much focus on one thing and one thing only, which is the criminalization of ecocide. And this makes it very simple to deal with from the perspective of politicians, of diplomats, of advocates, of NGOs, lawyers, faith leaders, all these many people that we deal with in the course of our work. What we are offering is something very, very simple. And that is very helpful, because I think there are a lot of movements out there, or a lot of organizations out there that have quite a broad agenda, and they may have lots of wonderful things that they wish to put forward. But when you're dealing with politicians and diplomats and legislators, it can really help to be highly, highly focused on one specific thing. And we believe this has helped a lot in terms of taking this conversation forward, because it enables us to bring this one particular conversation into many different contexts and show how relevant it is to all of these contexts. So I think that's a very important thing. Another aspect is that and this is something we have had to learn over the years, because as the conversation has gained better access at high level, for example, at UN conferences, in embassies, in ministries and so on, what we have had to learn in the diplomatic world is to be diplomatic. In other words, what we are very keen to do is to show to everybody we speak to the positive advantages of putting this law in place. Because often the biggest obstacle, and you were asking what are the hardships, often the biggest obstacle is understanding. Because when we're talking about criminal law, which is what we focus on, people often react people are scared, or people are, you talk about crime and people think about, a dark alley and someone with a knife. The word crime has certain connotations. So the first thing that we often have to explain is that criminal law is fundamentally about protection and prevention. Of course, murder is a crime, and we punish murderers, but that's how it works. That's not what it's for. What it's for is to prevent people killing each other. And that is the particular aspect of criminal law that is protective. And we need to put something in place for the living world, for the environment, that reflects that, and therefore creates a protection, a safeguard that prevents the worst harms from happening. And I think that understanding is one of the really key things that we have had to bring into every context in order to help to move this conversation forward. There are many other things, but I think that will give you a sort of initial idea of some of the aspects that we've been dealing with.
Exactly, Jojo. So, it's been a while you are going with this program, and you have to experience this in a very diplomatic manner. I believe that you have heard this question, Jojo. If someone asks you, Jojo, why we should criminalizing it, maybe this feel like repetitive, but I would like to have an answer for this. Okay, so people would ask from you, hi Jojo, there are laws already existing in the world. For an example, there are polluter pay theories and taxations and compensations for the organizations who are committing, or the individuals or the states committing these the offense against the environment, against the world and the humankind. So even though this is already existing, why are you expecting to criminalize this? This may be a question you came through. So what would be the answer for that again from you?
Yes, I completely understand. And we often get asked this. Of course, there is a large body of environmental law already in existence. It varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but it is very much there. It's quite a young body of law. It's grown up in the last few decades. But I think what we can see is that it is not succeeding currently in preventing the worst harms. And we would say that there are a number of reasons for this. One is that most environmental law sits in the regulatory sphere. It often involves quite specific lists of prohibitions or lists of, limitations of how much of a certain toxin you can use in a certain context, or all of these kinds of things, often very detailed. Now, the trouble with this is, I mean, I'm not saying that's not important. It is important for people to know what those limits are. But in practice, what often happens, particularly with big companies that can afford to do this, is that they will be gaming that system to some extent. For a start, there is very little moral stigma attached to breaching regulation. It's not thought of as something bad and wrong. But also there's a kind of, yes, playing games with the system that can happen. For example, if a certain thing is prohibited, a company will somehow recategorize what they're doing and say, well, we're not doing that exact thing. We're doing something different, and therefore it's okay. Or, for example, if they're allowed to use a certain amount of a toxin, they will constantly use that amount. And if it goes over the limit sometimes, well, maybe we can overlook it. Or if we have to pay a fine, it doesn't matter because we're making such a big profit. So all of those kinds of attitudes come alongside the regulatory approach. Now, the way that bringing in a criminal law can help is that it taps into something very different. It taps into the moral and ethical understanding of what is acceptable and not acceptable. No company is going to go to a government and say to them, can I have a license to kill 500 people for my new infrastructure project? It's literally not even going to cross their mind, because there's a strong criminal law against it, and there is a strong societal taboo against it. Now, that taboo doesn't exist in the same way with the destruction of the environment. And criminal law is one of those systemic levers that can help to create that taboo. Because what we are fundamentally looking at here is a big cultural problem. And the cultural problem sits mostly with the Western attitude, but that Western attitude has influenced the growth of the economic global network that we now have. The global economic system is based on that way of thinking, and that way of thinking is very disconnected from the natural world. Now, of course, there is a balance. We can't even build a house without doing something to the environment. Of course, that's obvious. Civilization, has to exist in some kind of relationship to the environment, which is not always going to preserve every part of it. We understand that. But what we have lost because of that inability to connect and to realize that we are part of nature, that without healthy ecosystems, we cannot exist as a civilization. When we have lost that balance, we have lost the understanding of what is safe and what is dangerous. And this is something that naming the worst harms as crimes can really help with. Because if we sit the concept of ecocide, if we sit the law of ecocide alongside genocide and crimes against humanity, what we are doing on a simple legal level is quite simple. We're adding a crime to a list of crimes. But conceptually and culturally, we're doing something much bigger. We're saying it's just as bad, wrong, and dangerous to severely destroy ecosystems as it is to destroy people. And of course, eventually it comes to the same thing. But of course, often the harm to the environment is not necessarily instantly damaging lots of people, but over time, it can have a really horrific effect. And so it's important to list it in that way, and important to acknowledge it in the criminal law space.
I more than agree with you. Like, no organization would go to a state and ask, let me kill 500 people for my organization. And the same manner, I really agree with you. So for my experience, once in Sri Lanka also, they introduced a law regarding to reduce the sachet size packets when it comes to the food and beverages and these things. What the organizations did is they increased the amount of the products in it, and they again produced another packet a bit more bigger than the sachet packets, and they are always trying to figure out the loopholes and go through it, and we experience it as a nation too. And amazing explanation, thank you, Jojo. And maybe the viewers of Sri Lanka, the law students, may have this problem. If I want to help your organization and to secure the whole world for the future organizations, future peoples, and future generations, how can we support you? Please explain us.
Well, I think the most important thing is to talk about the concept of ecocide, and of course within the legal world, within the academic world, is to raise this issue and to bring it under discussion, but also to show that it is all in a sense, if I use a very simple metaphor, the train has already left the station with ecocide law. It is already included in a European Environmental Crime Directive, at least to some extent. It's not pure ecocide law, but it's something close. And it's already being discussed at the International Criminal Court. And a number of individual jurisdictions are also discussing penalizing and incorporating ecocide into their criminal law systems. So a lot of the task ahead of us, and anyone who wants to support this work, is to bring attention to this and to say this is something that is going to support not only the environment going into the future, but also future generations and the world that we're growing up into, the world we're going to be working in. But also, I think, showing that there are also other governments and other countries that are working on this, and particularly with countries that are in development, it's a very clear way for governments to say, for governments of developing countries to say to the world, we know how to do this safely. It is not in, and the way that ecocide is defined, and of course, you can look this up on our website or anywhere where it's being discussed, but I will just run it by you now, just the simple definition of ecocide that has been proposed at the International Criminal Court. And it's ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term. Straightforward definition. It's strongly based on legal precedent from the Geneva Protocols, from the ENMOD Convention, from the other parts of the Rome Statute. But it is also a very simple definition. And very importantly, it focuses not on specific activities, but on the level of harm they create. And this is also very important in the context of developing countries, because there are various activities that that need to be engaged in order for economic development to move forward. Now, of course, there is the chance to move forward directly with much more sustainable approaches that have not been taken necessarily in the Western countries in the past. And of course, I mean, an obvious example is in telecommunications, where, the developing countries have totally, leapfrogged the very infrastructure heavy areas that the Western economies took and moved straight to the mobile economy. And there are going to be ways that can happen. But the important thing with this law is it is not saying what you should or shouldn't do. What it is saying is whatever you do, it should not create this level of harm. It should be done safely for people and for environment.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Jojo, for the amazing session with you. Thank you for giving you a very valuable time, even though there's a huge busy schedule with you. And we are coming to the end. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, any requirements, and anything to find about the Stop Ecocide International, you can already go to their social media platforms and figure out. And I would say this is a huge service for the whole world. Thank you, Jojo and team, for coming up with this concept and their hard work for the whole world. And we would really appreciate anything to add in the end, Jojo, to our audience today.
Just to say that please do go to our website, stopecocide.earth, and please do, engage with this conversation moving forward. We very much look forward to further communications. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, we have came to the end of our podcast program today. Thank you so much for watching. And thank you, Jojo, for giving your time again and again. We will meet from another episode in the future. See you all.